So thank you both for joining. My name is Cassie, and I am an assistant director here in career planning and development. And today we're going to talk about how to master the interview process. And so, a quick overview, we're going to talk about some strategies, different types of interviews, format, how to answer questions, your approach and attitude. We have some sample questions for you to also ask your interviewer, and then how to follow up in our recommendations. And so, what you do before the interview is as important as the interview itself. You want to be thoroughly prepared so that you have a better performance in that interview. So make sure you clarify, the timing, how is this interview taking place? Is it virtual? Is it in person? Is it a panel? Is it a half a day event where you're rotating through rooms? Understand all of those particulars beforehand. Understand how many interviewers to anticipate. It can be somewhat intimidating if you join an interview and there's a panel of people and you were not expecting that. So it's always good to be prepared and know what to expect. Another thing you want to do in preparation is make sure that you've researched the position thoroughly. So save that job description that you use to apply, because sometimes those kind of tend to disappear, after that job posting has closed, and review that description for those key characteristics, any of those specific qualifications that the employer is seeking, because it's very likely that you'll be asked questions that relate to what is already listed in that position description. So if you're like, how do I start preparing? That position description is a great thing to check on. It doesn't mean they're going to ask, specifically if you've memorized what the job is about, but if they're looking for someone with leadership skills, they're going to say, can you tell us about a time where you used your leadership skills to, manage a team? That's what they're looking for. And you'll be able to practice how you want to describe those specific experiences and how they relate to that specific employer's needs after you've done a little bit of research, you've read through the position description thoroughly, that kind of thing. You also want to make sure you connect with your network. So if you know someone who works in a similar role, you can reach out and ask what it's like to do that job. So from a different side of things, what that employer might value or what that type of job might entail, and different things that you have as far as questions about the position. You can make note of that. You're gathering information from all of your relevant resources. You also just want to research the company or the organization in general. Get to know them a little bit. Demonstrate your interest. You don't have to do a deep dive, but look on the company websites or, in some news searches to know maybe what projects or initiatives they're planning, big news sources that are relevant to them or their company from the last year. Have a list of questions to ask them specifically. Review information such as the organization mission or vision, their history, services and clients they serve, products they create, the structure and functions of departments, what the environment or culture is like, themes that they have on social media, company leaders that are really big to them. You don't have to know everything, but know a little bit about them. And then give attention to those details. So those first impressions matter. Show that you're detail-oriented and responsible. Make sure that you arrive early rather than late. Be prepared to wear, dress professionally with that company culture in mind. Wear what you might wear to the job or like one level above. And be prepared for that environment. So if it's going to be on Zoom, make sure you've opened Zoom and then you have the newest version downloaded so that you're not late. Those types of details really matter and can set that first impression. So there are a variety of different kinds of interviews that you can experience. Phone interviews are typically used as a screening tool to decide, who will make it to the next step for an interview in person or a more lengthy interview. So this can sometimes be a cold call from a recruiter, and can just have a few questions, or it can be, a full 30 minutes. So make sure you find a quiet location and that you have tested the cell reception in advance if you know that it's happening. Make sure you speak clearly, listen, and communicate sincerely, because they're not able to view your body language through the phone. So it's all about your voice in this instance. You can have some reference materials in front of you, like your resume, notes on questions you want to ask. Just make sure it doesn't sound like you're shuffling all of your papers throughout the interview, because they can hear those details. And then do your best to limit those verbal fillers, like, okay, most of those are natural, but if you're doing them overtly and too much, it is noticeable. Recorded interviews are an increasingly new and more popular type of interview that are starting to take some speed. So, they may send you a link where you're asked to answer questions and record yourself, and there's no one else on that other side. What this does is it increases some efficiency. It's really common for those large companies. It helps reduce those scheduling challenges. Some of these platforms will allow you to re-record, but some have limits. So make sure you understand the limits. So if you're like, oh, I want to re-record this one, but I only have 3 chances, make sure you're just keeping an eye on that. Do your best to be thoughtful and address each question. Sometimes I find that it's useful for people to mock as if they're in an interview with another person. So then when they get to each question, if they read it aloud to themselves, it kind of puts them in the mindset of, okay, I was just asked this question and I'm going to answer it now, rather than just not knowing how to start out because no one's verbally asked you the question. You can read it to yourself out loud, and that's perfectly fine. Make sure you look at your camera, because you can't have eye contact. So you're doing the next best thing by looking at the camera. Another type of interview can be a virtual interview, on a variety of different platforms. Since the pandemic, it's become very common for interviews to take place virtually. You may not get an in-person interview. It may all be virtual. It may start with a phone interview, go to virtual, and a decision is made. So make sure you're comfortable using the platform. So if you've never used Teams before, maybe try to use it somehow beforehand to just know where the mute button is and things like that. Make sure that your computer app or browser is updated so it can support what they're asking you to use. Make sure you have a good internet connection and that it's quiet. You're not in a busy coffee shop, or you don't have people walking behind you outside, things like that. Give your full attention to the interview. Make sure you get there a few minutes early, join that chat room a little early, just in case you have any of those technical issues, in case Zoom decides to do a last minute update. And then always be mindful of your background in a virtual interview. So it should look professional. There are ways to blur the background if you feel like you're not as professional as you would like behind you. So just keep that in mind. Other types of interviews include technical interviews. So depending on the role or the company, you may have to take an assessment or demonstrate your technical skills in a certain way. And so the technical interview could be before moving on for a software developer position, or in banking or finance. And so common ways to prepare for this is to make sure you study any topics or materials that you need to brush up on. So if you are going to interview to be an investment broker, it would be really great to know what the stock market is doing at this moment in time. It would also be really great to study the company and be prepared to answer a few questions based on the general industry. So if I were to trade these stocks in this quarter, what can I expect as my rate of return? Those are some of those types of questions. When you are asked a technical interview question, it's important to focus on voicing your thought process or the logic steps that your brain is taking and walk through that process verbally. It's not just getting to the right answer, it's they want to see how you're able to problem solve and what steps you take to work through that. So voice what you're thinking through. Specifically for brain teasers, the answer is often irrelevant. If you say, we have this jar of marbles, how many marbles are in the jar? They don't care if you guess that accurately. They might not even know how many marbles are in that jar, but they want to see the strategy that you use, the logic that you use to try and guess that how many marbles are in that jar. So make sure you voice your methodology. It's certainly okay to ask clarifying questions. So if you're unsure, you can ask for a rephrase on technical interview questions, things like that. And it's typically okay to take scratch notes, especially if you're asked to do like some sort of math and it's easier to write things down. Just be aware that you may need to ask permission beforehand, or you may need to relinquish your notes at the end of the interview so that the questions they ask you don't walk out the door. So just be aware of that. You can always say, hey, can I take a few notes during this interview to jot down some thoughts, and they may have some answers for you there. The time-old in-person interview still takes place, and so these are typically later stages of the hiring process. You may interact with one or multiple interviewers. You may get a tour of the company while you're there or walk around the office. You may have several interviews in one day with different stakeholders. So that's always great to know who you're going to talk to, what your day is going to look like, so that you can plan ahead, know maybe what kind of shoes to wear if you're going to be walking, those types of things. Another type of interview is a group interview. So this will typically be one interviewer or observer, but multiple candidates together. And so they are interested in observing how the candidates interact with one another. So how you interact in a team environment. The interviewer may pay attention to who is leading the group, who is following, who behaves and speaks professionally, who seeks to dominate the conversation, how different problems are solved, those types of things. So in these types of interviews, it's best to take some space and make sure that you are participating and being verbal with the group, but also make space for others to participate as well. So even if you're not the team leader, because not everyone can be a team leader and they may not be looking for a team leader, if you notice that someone else is being rather quiet and you've had some time to contribute and someone else is maybe dominating the conversation, you can ask that quiet person, hey, do you have anything to add here? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Just making that space is sometimes impressive enough to show that you know how to communicate and make space for others on a team. Sometimes you'll be assigned a project or a task to solve. These are less common, but they do occur for some student hiring or maybe graduate school interviews. A lot of counseling programs still do group interviews. So just something to be aware of. Typically, interview formats go this way. So it starts with a greeting and introduction. You want to be gracious and polite, shake hands, firm handshake, quick and professional. Sometimes there may be casual conversation about the weather or did you find parking okay? It's best to stay positive and brief on those topics. Sometimes the employer may give you an idea of the format of the interview, an overview of the position, or an overview of the organization. In some hiring practices, it may be required for interviews to stick to a very specific script of questions and interview style, and they may not be allowed to diverge beyond that. So this is just to make sure that everyone has the same interview experience across the board. So don't get thrown off if it feels overly formal or if the interviewers are reading questions from a piece of paper. That is typically how some companies require it. And so don't feel thrown off by that. That's just how they do it. Make sure that you answer the interview questions. Typically, the most time-consuming portion of the interview is the questions they're asking you. This is your opportunity to elaborate on your qualifications. So talk about things that may be a little bit on your resume, but aren't all on your resume. Expand beyond just this the explanation that you gave in your cover letter. This is your time to really share those details. Make sure that you're providing clear examples and that you're highlighting those relevant skills that they're asking you about. Then it comes to the time where you're allowed to ask the interviewer some questions. It's really always best to be prepared to ask a few. Some of them may have been answered during the course of the interview already, so plan to have 3 to 5 questions that reflect your genuine interest in the position or organization. In case some of them got asked during the interview, you typically will have 1 to 2 or 3 left over to ask. You can also ask them to provide additional information about a topic discussed during the interview or refer to information that you learned during your employer research. So you can say, hey, I saw that you guys are working on this really great project this year. I'd love to learn more about what your goals are for that, to show that you've done some of that research. And this will communicate to the interviewer that you were both listening and that you were prepared. So you can follow up based on things you talked about or things you researched. And then at the closing of the interview, the interviewer may outline what you can expect to happen next in the process. And if they don't, it is appropriate for you to ask next steps. So if they're wrapping up and they're saying, thank you so much for being here, you can say, yeah, this was great. I'd love to know, what to expect, when I can expect to hear back on a decision or next steps. Make sure you gather contact information or remind yourself of names as needed, especially if there were multiple people in the interviewer. And then be sure to thank them for their time. End on a positive interview note. Some things I do see a lot is people asking, are there any hesitations that you had of me or anything that you feel like I'm missing? Typically wouldn't advise asking that at the end of an interview because you're leaving them on thinking the things that you're missing or the things that you didn't quite hit the mark on. So I would avoid that question, especially towards the end of an interview. When it comes to the way that you answer their questions, there are a variety of different strategies we can talk through here. And so the way you respond helps tell that interviewer whether or not you're qualified. So it's important to be prepared for a variety of different questions you could be asked. This is why reading that job description is really helpful because that is going to guide the types of questions that they're likely going to ask you. You can create an interview study guide from that job description with those key phrases. Make sure you have some of your strengths and challenges already kind of explored and written down. Write down specific examples or experiences where you've demonstrated the qualifications that they're asking for so that you just have those examples ready to go in your brain. I would advise, practicing before your scheduled interview. Try to get a list of sample questions or prepare an outline of potential answers that you might use, but do your best to avoid just reading back something you've typed up. You want it to feel natural and conversational, not robotic and just read aloud. You can practice with our office. You can do mock interview appointments with us. You can also use something called My Interview Practice for free with your Webster email. And so I've pulled that up here. This will allow you to create interviews based on what industry you're looking through, different things like that. If you select this interviews by job position, you can type in the title of the job position you plan on interviewing for. You can also upload your resume. And then the software uses AI to choose questions that will be specific to both that industry and also specific to your resume and your work history. So it is really fairly smart and it kind of tailors that interview specifically for yourself. This allows you to record it and watch it back, obtain any feedback from that as well. So this is a great resource to use. And I will send out this presentation so you can get to this link, but it's My Interview Practice and it's the Webster link specifically. This is also located as a resource in our Handshake resources under the Career Center tab. The most common type of interview questions in today's interviews are behavioral interview questions. And that's typically because past performance is an indicator of that future performance. So if you handled it a certain way before, you should be able to do it again, or you're more likely to do it that way again. So it requires responses that include specific examples or instances of when you've maybe demonstrated that particular skill. So they're fairly easy to recognize. A lot of them open like, tell me about a time when this happened, or what did you do when this occurred? Have you ever done this? And to give me an example. Describe a situation and where this occurred. And so to be successful in this type of interview, you want to draw on those specific examples. So instead of saying, I have a variety of different leadership skills that I've used in a variety of different settings, pick a specific time where you used your leadership skills, because that's going to be much more applicable to that STAR framework that we're going to talk about next. And they're asking for those specific instances rather than a broad explanation or smattering. So tell me about a time when you demonstrated leadership skills to lead a team through a challenging problem. You will use the STAR method to answer these behavioral interview questions. The STAR method is great because it is effective at answering each piece that you want to hit. It keeps you from rambling on. It has a natural wrap up, and it gives the interviewer exactly what they're looking for. So STAR stands for situation, task, action, and result. So when you get the question, you want to explain, okay, the situation, explain the context of the example you're going to use, be clear and concise. You don't want to go on forever just setting it up the details. Talk about the task you were responsible for completing or the solution you developed. So this is what we were asked to do. These are the things that I did. Explain the action that you took or how you executed that process, and then explain the results. People generally do really well with the situation, task, and action, but they often forget the result. So make sure that you don't forget that, and it allows you to kind of have a natural wrap up or ending. It talks about the lessons learned. Maybe, there's some data points you can include in there. Even if it was not a successful outcome, explain the things that you learned along the way. Results can be a variety of different things. You could have received great feedback from a client you helped, or from a supervisor, from your team. A lot of people will use examples talking about group projects that they've worked on in class, and they leave the result off, and I'm always left wondering, well, did you turn in the project? Did you get an A? Did it go well? Those are all the things that I want to know as an interviewer. So don't forget the result piece. So here's an example here. So describe a time when you had to deal with a dissatisfied customer. At my current job, a customer called and they were upset that they'd received incorrect information from a member of the sales team that impacted their account. They were angry and threatened to find another vendor. So customer retention is very important to my company, and it was imperative that I tried to relieve the situation and keep their business. I spoke calmly and took responsibility as the company rep. I told them that I wanted to correct the error and repeated their concern back to them to make sure I understood the problem and actually fixed the issue. And the result was, after hearing that I owned the company's accountability for the problem, they started to calm down. I addressed the issue and honored the previous contract information they were given. And before we hung up, they apologized for getting upset and said that they were going to remain a customer. That's a great way to wrap it up, especially if you're kind of a rambler. I know I'm a rambler. Genuinely saying, and the result was, helps me know, okay, it's time to wrap it up. And this is what I'm focusing on now. Sometimes you'll be asked a negative slanted question. So you may be asked about weaknesses you've encountered or weaknesses you have, or challenging situations you may have encountered in your past that didn't necessarily work out the way you wanted them to. It's important to choose something authentic and still be truthful when you are asked these questions. But make sure that it's not crucial to the job role when you're picking what weakness to talk about. So if you say you get nervous speaking in front of large groups, but you're interviewing for a data entry role, that's probably not going to impact much, and that's okay. If you struggle focusing on small details, that's probably something you don't want to bring up for the data entry role. So keep it truthful, but make it not seem as detrimental to the position that you're applying for. And for these negative slanted questions, you want to end on a positive note. So discuss what you learned, talk about how you've improved, or what you would like to do differently next time, so that you're reframing and ending to reverse that negative slanted question. Your approach and attitude matter. So interviewers pay attention to more than just what you're saying. They pay attention to body language, that nonverbal communication, the way responses are delivered, your overall positivity or attitude. Make sure that you're exhibiting good posture and you're sitting up straight. Maintain effective eye contact, but you don't have to stare. Learn to communicate interest and engage in that conversation. Lean forward, shows you're listening. Try to avoid nervous habits, like playing with your hair or clicking a pen. Make sure that you talk at a consistent pace. On average, you want your responses to be typically within, that 3-minute time range. Some might be shorter, some might be longer. And so just keep in mind that, and be conscious of your volume and your tone of voice. You want to display some confidence, speak objectively about qualifications without feeling like you're appearing to be bragging or boastful. Have a sense of humor, smile. You don't have to be super funny, but be engaging. Demonstrate your interpersonal communication skills. Respond concisely but with enthusiasm. Make sure you're saying, I'm very interested in this company and in this role. And then treat the interviewers politely. Be kind to them, because you're making an impression and they're going to remember it. Some common questions you could get in an interviewer fit in a variety of different topics. So they typically have introductions, discussion of qualifications, motivations, limitations, or fit. And so some of the simplest questions can be the most challenging to answer. The most broad, tell me about yourself, is the one that trips everyone up at the beginning of an interview, because they don't know what to start with, what to include, when to stop. Or why did you choose this career path? Why are you interested in working in this organization? That's where your research comes in handy and what you learned about that organization. What are your greatest strengths? What are your weaknesses? Knowing to end that on a positive note. Additional ones are, tell me about your proudest accomplishment. Sometimes people forget to be proud of themselves, so having an answer ready to go for this one is a really good one. Talk about a time where you didn't succeed in something and what you learned from that. So when you didn't meet a deadline, describe a situation that required you to multitask. How did you find balance? Where you worked on a team project, maybe the team didn't get along well. How are you going to explain that? Describe a situation where you had to handle something unexpected and show adaptability. How did you respond? Those 3 here, these 4 here, those are the ones you answer with the STAR method. The tell me about yourself question, you want to focus a little bit on your past, present, and future. So, what have you done already that may be relevant? So maybe you got a bachelor's degree in this thing. What are you doing now? You're getting a master's degree. And then where are you going? So you would love to get an internship or a job in this specific sector. That's what you're looking for. And so you do a little bit of that past, present, and future. I would typically advise focusing more on your work experience or your education rather than personal details. They want to know, a little bit of your personality, but that generally shines through with how you answer the questions, rather than saying, in my free time, I like to play Frisbee. That's not as impressive as if you said, I'm a member of the computer science club. While I'm getting my degree at Webster, I've already had an internship in this experience, and I'm looking to do an internship in this direction now. Once you have answered the interview questions, then they will typically give you time to ask them questions. So you want to have those 3 to 5 questions prepared. You can talk about any of the following categories, what the business process may look like, what the office culture is like, ask specific questions about the responsibilities you may have in the job, what professional development opportunities the organization offers, what the team is like, what the organization is like as a whole. Remember to do your research and have some of those values or information, already known, so you can ask more in-depth questions to impress them and say, yes, I've taken time to learn more about your company and I'd love to learn more about this thing. So some common questions you may ask at the end are, what characteristics make someone successful in this position? What's a typical career path for this position? Where do people go on after this, or where do they start from before? How does this position fit in the organization structure? What are the biggest challenges facing this position? What is your leadership or management style? Who do the people in this role typically interact with? What opportunities are for professional development, or what do you enjoy most about this organization? Once you wrap up, you always want to send a thank you. Typically, I prefer something within that 24-hour period, but within 48 hours is okay. Send it via email. Take note of the names of the people who were a part of the interview. And if you don't have their direct emails, you ask that person that you have been communicating via emails. Say, hey, I know that Joan and Tim were also in the interview, but I didn't get a chance to get their emails. Can you please pass on my thanks to them as well? Just remembering their name is impressive enough. And don't expect a response to your thank you email. Unless you're asking a specific question, make sure you're asking that question to that recruiting manager or that hiring manager that you've been working with. Or make sure that you're asking it to the person who can give you the answer that you're looking for, rather than asking, the CEO of the company about your pay rates. The HR person is much more appropriate person to ask those questions to. But don't expect a response. It's totally okay if you don't get a response to those thank you emails, but people still acknowledge them and appreciate them. Include a personal detail to show that you were engaged and you remember things about the interview. So I really loved that third floor conference room and the beautiful view that we had, or I loved the way that all of the pods are organized so that everyone can collaborate across the office. Reiterate your position. It's okay to take some time to further emphasize any interests or qualifications you want to bring up again. You can always ask those follow-up questions if needed, and include, some specific details to show that you are paying attention. Be sure to thank them so much for their time and say, I look forward to hearing from you for next steps. So I will come back. So if you are a first-year student and you want to get points for the Cornerstone Cup, I have the QR code here. I'm going to go away from that for just a second to show you that LinkedIn also has a great interview resource. So in addition to using our office and that My Interview Practice dashboard, if you go to the jobs part of LinkedIn and you go to the interview prep, there are a variety of different types of categories that you can check out that have specific interview questions. They have tips on how to answer specific questions, or samples on, how other people have asked those questions. You can also utilize AI. So the way that AI used on My Interview Practice comes up with the questions for you. On LinkedIn, the AI provides you feedback. So it may not be as perfect as a person, but if you want to take some time to just type out some generic answers and see if you're on the right track, the LinkedIn AI can help provide some feedback that way. So those are just some things to keep in mind. And now I will leave this Cornerstone Cup up if you want to scan it and see if anyone has any questions. All right. Oh, Jennifer, did you have a question?
I was going to say thank you so much because it's been really helpful to learn all these things.
Oh, good. Well, I'm really glad. And you can always, come to our office and chat through specific, interview strategies, or if you are saying, I want to practice for this specific interview, we can always kind of tailor specific questions to that and do a full mock interview if you ever want to.
That's great. Thank you.
You're welcome. Any
Yeah,
other comment? Oh,
I
yeah.
thank you, Cassie. Yeah, it was great having you and learning new things about here.
Good.
Things are a bit different from my native here, and it's great to
Yes.
learn.
Good. Well, I'm glad it's been useful, and I think it's really good to, help understand the interview culture, especially if you're coming from, a different country where people do things differently, to show kind of what it's like to interview here as general in the US.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah.
You're welcome. Well, thank you for joining, and I will send out the materials and the recordings to this so you have them. And please feel free to share with your friends so that they have these resources as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Have a good afternoon.
You too. Bye bye.